Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Hello everybody and welcome to this special Espresso Martini, or maybe it's an Espresso Vodka Martini today. Over the weekend we were as shocked as everyone else at the turn of events in Russia, and we hope today to sort of shed some light on what is known so far in this special podcast. Before we kick in, Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's good to see you again so soon. Wonder why that happened.
I know. Honestly, it's been quite an interesting weekend.
Yeah.
And I have not had much sleep as I'd like to have done, because all this kicked off on sort of Friday night, fair enough, as I was posting up the Espresso Martini that came out, and suddenly saw there might be a coup happening in Russia. I thought, oh shit. So yeah. So what I'll do, I'm gonna. So today we're just gonna obviously talk about what's known. There's still a lot of unknowns at the moment, or known unknowns. Maybe if we quote, who was that again?
That was Donald Rumsfeld.
Donald Rumsfeld. There we go. Known knowns, known unknowns.
May he rest in peace.
Yes. So today what we're going to do, I'm going to start off with who Prigozhin is. We'll talk a little bit about what the Wagner group is, because there are, over conversations I've had with people over the weekend, there's some people out there who still don't know who they are. Mm-hmm. And then we will kind of go into the events themselves, pretty much in the format that we usually do an Espresso Martini. So what I'll do, I'm going to start with who Yevgeny Prigozhin is, and we're going to go into his background. So taking just from Wikipedia, because that was the easiest resource, Prigozhin is a Russian oligarch, and he is a mercenary chief, and he is a former close confidant of Russian President Vladimir Putin, and we will emphasize the former, or so we believe anyway. And now. Prigozhin is sometimes, for now, Prigozhin is sometimes called Putin's chef, because he owned a number of restaurants and catering companies that provided services for the Kremlin. Notably, as his time as chef, he served then Prince Charles in 2003, who's now King Charles, and President Bush in 2006. So he has been sort of connected to Western circles through his catering. He was also once a convict in the Soviet Union, and Prigozhin now controls, or did control, a network of influential companies, including obviously the Russian state-backed mercenary group, the Wagner Group, and 3 companies accused of interference in the 2016 and 2018 US elections. You could probably add Scottish independence and Brexit to that.
Yeah.
And according to a 2022 investigation by Bellingcat, The Insider, and Der Spiegel, Prigozhin's activities are tightly integrated with the Russian Defense Ministry and its intelligence arm, the GRU. So that's a bit about Prigozhin. Matt, I don't know if you've got any quick thoughts on Prigozhin himself that you want to share? Or...
No, I think that was a pretty good overview of him. Kind of a general...
Thank you, Wikipedia.
Yeah, general psychopath. I mean, this is a guy who... just sends his troops across the line in Ukraine as like cannon fodder, executes deserters with sledgehammers to the head, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Let's look at who the Wagner Group are, because I think it's a good idea just to explain a bit about them. So I've actually found a piece called Band of Brothers, the Wagner Group and the Russian State. It's actually back from September 2020. I've just updated some key points at the bottom. So I'll just read out the key points of this article from the Center of Strategic Studies, but I think it gives a good overview who Wagner are. So the Wagner Group, they first appeared in Ukraine in 2014, where it participated in the annexation of Crimea. So obviously you can already see how they're totally integrated into what's going on at the moment. The Russian private military group, known as the Wagner Group, is closely intertwined with the Russian military and the intelligence community, making it a proxy organization of the Russian state rather than a conventional business. It operates in support of Russian interests. It receives equipment from the Russian Ministry of Defense and has used Ministry of Defense installations for training. The group shares a base with the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, and it relies on Russian military infrastructure, including transport and healthcare services. One of the founders, Dmitry Utkin, I hope I got his surname right there, he has ties to the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, and obviously we've mentioned Yevgeny Prigozhin. He up until recently had very close ties with then President Vladimir Putin. So while the Wagner Group itself is not ideologically driven, elements of it have been linked to neo-Nazism and far-right politics. As I think you and I have mentioned, there are members who have like tattoos.
The SS death's head, like the runes, yeah.
They have tattoos with SS symbols and swastikas and what have you on them. And I've never quite understood how a country like Russia, that has a big history of during World War II of fighting the Nazis, that somehow Nazi symbols have sort of become mainstreamed since the fall of the Soviet Union. I never quite understood that.
And that the Russians in particular in World War II faced like the worst of Nazi barbarity.
Yeah, it makes no sense at all why they would celebrate. But as we've said on other podcasts, Russia has in the last few years been trying to position itself as the savior of the white Christian world, and it has a lot of support from the far right, and it also has been very influential and directly supported far right groups across Europe, potentially with the aim to destabilize European politics. Just to further add then, Russia has a history of using proxy forces abroad and sees private military contractors as political military tools for extending its influence with plausible deniability. PMCs allow Russia to hide personnel losses and deny involvement in conflicts, as their losses are not officially counted as part of the regular military. While private military companies, PMCs, are illegal in Russia, there are legal loopholes, surprise there, that allow their operation. And there are also state-run organisations and enterprises that also have private armed forces and security foundations, and they register those companies abroad. That sort of seems to be the loophole there. The Wagner operatives use passports issued by a special desk linked to Russia's Ministry of Defense. The Russian state has shown presidential intervention and support for the Wagner Group in situations like the arrests of operatives in Belarus. And then based on all that evidence, the Wagner Group should be considered a proxy organisation closely connected to the Russian state rather than just a private military company. Now, just adding to all that, so during obviously the Ukraine war, tensions have grown between Wagner and the Russian government. Wagner have complained about equipment and weapons supplies. Prigozhin has been openly critical of Russian military leadership over the last few months, and recent tensions have sort of grown when Russian military command called for the company to be incorporated directly under their command. Signs of tension between Prigozhin and the Russian government spilled into the open during the Battle of Bakhmut, which saw heavy losses for Wagner. Prigozhin recently made a statement just before the events of last weekend that some have interpreted as a thinly veiled attack on Putin himself, and he declared that while his men were dying due to the Ministry of Defence's failures to supply ammunition, a happy granddad is thinking he's doing well. And then he referred to that granddad with an obscenity. So before we go back to you, Matt, just one last thing with Wagner. So I just wanted to quickly say where they have been reported to operate. So obviously Ukraine, they were involved and took a lead role in Russia's war against the country, and they've been there since 2014, and they've been supporting pro-Russian separatist forces against the Ukraine government. Syria, the Wagner Group gained significant attention for its involvement in the Syrian civil war. Its operatives have been deployed to support the Syrian government forces and have been engaged in combat against rebel groups, including the Islamic State. In Sudan, there have been reports of the Wagner Group personnel operating in Sudan, private security and military support for the Sudanese government. In Libya, they're well-travelled, these people.
Yeah.
Wagner Group mercenaries have been involved in the civil war there, and they've been supporting forces of General Khalifa Haftar, who is aligned with the Libyan National Army. Then, in the Central African Republic, CAR, the Wagner Group operatives have been deployed to CAR, providing security and military assistance to the government in its fight against rebel groups. Also, as we mentioned earlier, Prigozhin and the Wagner Group have also been linked to online troll farms and hackers who played a role in interfering in the US presidential elections of 2016 and 18, and I added also Brexit and Scottish independence is worth considering. They also are involved in influence campaigns across Africa and the Middle East. Most of those campaigns have been sort of recently geared towards trying to build support for Russia's actions against Ukraine. And obviously, I think we've mentioned in the Middle East and Africa, some countries have been a bit murky on how they feel about the war in Ukraine, and some have even openly supported Russia. So after all that, Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you for any thoughts and observations on the Wagner Group.
So Wagner, over the course of the past few years, really starting with their involvement intervening in the Syrian civil war on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, and especially through the first year or so of this civil war, Wagner's really and Prigozhin himself has kind of begun to operate as a parallel armed wing of like this sort of Putinist ideology. Like I think previously we've drawn comparisons, to like the SS. In a way, like it's very much represents that kind of ultra nationalist, highly militaristic strain of I guess Russian political discourse that's really kind of taken off since the war in Ukraine began. And just to show you a bit of how closely coordinated Wagner is with the Russian state. So there's a base near Krasnodar, which is in southern Russia. There's a barracks there where a Spetsnaz unit, so a Russian Special Forces unit that's subordinated to the GRU, Russian Military Intelligence. So basically, like if you went through the gates of this GRU barracks, if you turn to the left, that's where the Spetsnaz brigade is garrisoned. If you go to the right side of the space, that's where Wagner had their main base inside Russia. Wow. So like kind of co-located in the same area. Historically I've been very close.
Yeah. It's like having the Navy SEALs and Blackwater training together, isn't it, or something?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, so I guess kind of a comparison would be, I mean, they're not quite as close, but so SEAL Team 6, they're headquartered at Dam Neck Annex right on the beach in Virginia Beach, and Blackwater, now I think it's called Academy. Their main base or their like training facility is in Moyock, North Carolina, which is only a couple miles south from Virginia Beach. So there are a lot of comparisons. There's sort of another comparison I can get into when we get more into like what the coup itself was.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one thing I would add, obviously, it's nothing great revelation here, but it kind of feels like that since 2014, that Wagner have almost become the elite of Russian forces.
Pretty much. I mean, they've really, I think, performed the best. I use best, relatively, compared to the regular Russian army units, especially in Syria as well. I mean, it's also the U.S. military has come in direct contact with them before. So this was during the Trump administration, early on in the Trump administration, fairly early, when James Mattis was still Secretary of Defense. We got into a bit of a scrap with Wagner mercenaries. I believe James Mattis called Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, who will come up a bit more in this whole story, and kind of had this discussion. And Sergei Shoigu was like, well, they're not actually official Russian forces. So, what happens to them happens. And we bombed Wagner's position in Syria, killed hundreds of them. And, they kind of never interfered with our operations in Syria again.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting, this rift that we'll talk about in a moment between Putin and Prigozhin now challenges and creates an issue for Russian projection of power abroad, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, so they're, like you've pointed out, where they've operated a lot in Central Africa, really exerting a lot of influence in Central Africa, helped turn the tide in Syria in Bashar al-Assad's favor. They've had work in Venezuela before on behalf of Nicolas Maduro. Kind of it's this sort of PMC, this private military structure that Wagner operates under, has enabled the Russians to exert a lot of influence in the third world, I guess you could say, but with a degree of deniability, which has been really useful just as a tool of Russian power. And right now it's kind of unclear what'll happen to Wagner's operations outside of Russia and Ukraine. We don't really know yet.
No, indeed. Well, let's go into the main event, right, and then we can kind of we can open up the conversation a bit. So let's look at the events over the weekend then. So our next piece I've picked out is by Professor Phillips O'Brien, who is a professor of strategic studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And Professor O'Brien writes a great weekly blog on updates relating to the Ukraine war on his Substack. So we'll link to that obviously in the show notes. So my notes here are from Substack weekend update number 34. So I'll just read out the key points, then Matt, I'll come to you. So On the 24th of June, Yevgeny Prigozhin issued a statement that claimed the Russian military had launched an attack on his Wagner military base in Ukraine. And in response to the rocket strike, Prigozhin said he would move to punish those responsible. Russian authorities then launched a criminal investigation against Prigozhin, calling for his arrest. Prigozhin and his men hit the road in an armed convoy from Ukraine to Moscow. Prigozhin said that his men in the convoy would punish those military leaders who ordered the strike, and said his troops would fire on any troops trying to stop them. Prigozhin's convoy quickly gained control over strategic cities like Rostov and Voronezh, and their convoy headed towards Moscow. As the convoy approached the capital, a sudden turn of events occurred. Prigozhin and Putin reached a deal mediated by Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, and leading to the Wagner column to turn back and Prigozhin entering a form of exile. The reasons behind Prigozhin's decision to stop are unclear, but it appears he may have felt threatened by the potential consequences of his actions. Prigozhin insisted that his actions were not a military coup, but a march for justice. So I guess he was trying to compare himself maybe to French lorry drivers or something.
Yeah.
And Prigozhin, in an earlier statement, actually even accused Moscow of lying to the public about Russia's war on Ukraine. And he said that, and it's interesting wording, but he said that the Ministry of Defense is trying to deceive the public and the president and spin the story that there were insane levels of aggression from the Ukrainian side and that they were going to attack us together with the whole NATO bloc. So with that statement, he kind of lets Putin off the hook there. And he further added that when Zelensky became president, he was ready for agreements. All that needed to be done was for the Russian government to get off Mount Olympus and negotiate with him. So that's an interesting statement there. The long-term implications of this deal and between Prigozhin and the Russian government and the fate of Wagner itself are now kind of in the wind. We don't really know what's going to happen there. And we also don't know what's going to happen to the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov, who've been in charge of Russian military forces in Ukraine to date. Professor O'Brien, interestingly, sees this event as a mutiny rather than a deliberate coup. And he said that the mutiny looked like it was the result of remarkable long-term logistical planning, which I think's almost been confirmed by the by U.S. intelligence from some reporting I've seen, that apparently there's been chatter about something like this for some time. And what this mutiny has done is expose the weakness of the Putinist state, as the government was very slow to react and has insufficient military forces to counter the uprising. Ultimately, Putin has sort of surprisingly spared Prigozhin, despite this mutiny causing significant humiliation for Putin and casting doubt on his unchallenged power. And we will see what the consequences of this are as they play out in the weeks and months ahead. So, Matt, back over to you. Any thoughts on any of this and what we witnessed over the weekend?
Well, I think if you want sort of like, if you want to compare it to like, okay, if this happened in the United States, what would it have looked like? Because I think that maybe helps people get a better idea of what happened if they put it in the context of, you know, their own country and their own system. So it's essentially equivalent to if like Eric Prince, who was the founder of Blackwater, right? If he was in a months-long dispute with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and Mark Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right, over the direction of a U.S. war somewhere. And finally, the dispute between them got so bad that Eric Prince had like 20,000 men and seized control of Tampa, Florida, which is where U.S. Special Operations Command and U.S. Central Command is headquartered. I mean, that's the sort of relationship that Rostov has with the Russian military, right? That's the U.S. military does with Tampa, right? So let's say Eric Prince took control of Tampa and then was marching up I-95 along the East Coast with 20,000 men to reach Washington and I don't know, do something to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs when he got there. And then got to about, let's say, Richmond, Virginia, right, a couple 100 miles south of D.C. And then Justin Trudeau negotiated a deal with him that he was going to stop and turn around. And in exchange, he was going to go into exile in Canada. that's basically what happened.
Very good way to put it.
Which I think shows you kind of how, when you put it in that terms, describe it that way, shows how kind of just crazy the whole thing was. I mean, yeah, while it was happening on Saturday and stuff, the coup word was being thrown around, and there were like some people on Twitter who was like, well, unless it comes from the coup d'etat region of France, it's not really a coup. It's just like sparkling armed upheaval. Right.
Like oh my God.
And I think we've kind of firmly, for a long time, we didn't really know what Prigozhin's intentions were. And I think even now, we don't fully know. I don't think Prigozhin fully knew what his intentions were when he started this. But it could have been a coup.
It reminds me a bit like Boris Johnson and Brexit. I don't think he really thought it was going to happen.
A bit. There's another note there that I can compare Boris to in a second. But it could have easily become a coup. I think we've sort of landed now on that it was a mutiny, right? So he was marching up to Moscow to punish the leadership of the Ministry of Defense. I think Prigozhin quickly became sort of afraid by his own success that he was able to, drive hundreds of kilometers through the middle of Russia virtually unopposed. He met a little resistance. I think Wagner forces on the way up shot down 6 Russian army helicopters, a fixed wing airborne command post aircraft that had a crew of like 6 or something. So there were casualties taken over the course of this. And I guess saw that he didn't intend to challenge Putin, but it got to the point where it could have very quickly transpired that the government collapsed, which I think is something that's so, scary about this. So that could have potentially been a lot worse than it was. Like, Putin, we saw in like sort of like flight radar apps, people were noticing that 2 aircraft that are part of the Russia Special Transport Squadron that Putin usually uses in the morning on Saturday departed Moscow and was flying towards St. Petersburg, right? So like abandoned the capital. And there's some other reports that Putin, while this happened, landed at an estate he has in Valdai, which is like a national park about halfway between Russia and St. Petersburg. He spent much of COVID there, I think. So sort of fled Moscow. So, I mean, I was this was my thought as it was happening, that, if Prigozhin reached Moscow and, the Russian National Guard troops and stuff there in the city were like digging trenches and putting in roadblocks and bulldozing up sections of the highway to sort of stop him. If he had reached Moscow, and then what? What would you have done then? And I think if Wagner troops marched into the Kremlin unopposed, and Putin had fled to St. Petersburg or to some other, country estate, I think there would have been real questions as to who's in charge of the country, And there were quite a few really provocative sort of moves that Wagner took. So on their tanks and their vehicles, Wagner men painted red Zs on these vehicles. So the letter Z stands for the Russian word Zapad. Has since the beginning of the war in Ukraine has been kind of like their symbol for that war, right?
Yeah.
So all Russian military vehicles kind of have this white Z painted on it. But Wagner troops during this mutiny painted a red Z, which sort of evokes so during the Russian Civil War in 1970, the Bolshevik rebels at that point were the Red Army facing off with the sort of anti, I guess, or pro-czarist forces, the White Army. So very kind of in the annals of Russian history, that kind of memory, very provocative statements that would lead one to suspect that, are they coming for the whole thing? And, Putin even raised the specter of civil war in 1970 and then 1917 in his statement, calling Prigozhin a traitor.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I was shocked by the sudden turn of events, and, your imagination kind of runs wild a little bit, because if you look at so what was interesting to me, and we'll probably come into this bit more of the Anne Applebaum bit in a minute, but sort of seeing how the locals reacted to Wagner forces entering town, and also the military.
Yeah.
They were basically, people were siding with them. I think I mean, I'm speculating here, but I think they could have actually got into Moscow with a little bit of battle, but I think most people may well have folded and sided with them. And I think that was, Yeah,
I mean, so this Wagner column departed the front in Ukraine, drove back into Russia to Rostov, which is close to the border, but not that close. It's still a bit of a distance. Occupied Rostov, where the headquarters of the Southern Military District is, without firing a shot, which means that, the other forces in Rostov, or that they encountered along the way, either stood aside and didn't oppose them, or were actively supporting them. I think it's possible that they could have taken the Kremlin if they wanted to, which really kind of shows you how fragile this regime actually is. And, to your point about the reaction of Russian citizens in Vostok, I mean, they were kind of, walking around, taking pictures up on Wagner tanks, chatting with the soldiers. At the end of the day on Saturday, after this was resolved and Wagner troops left Rostov, people were
even chanting Wagner, Wagner.
Yeah, they were out in the streets cheering them. And I mean, so Prigozhin kind of said the quiet part out loud in this mutiny, which is that, Shoigu and Gerasimov are kind of just hopelessly corrupt and feckless, and their actions have gotten 100,000 Russians killed for nothing. Came out and said, this war wasn't because the need to denazify Ukraine or because of NATO expansion. It was because, the Russian leadership wanted to basically just plunder Ukraine, which is something that we all know. But if you're swept up in Russia's, state-run propaganda vacuum, that might be news to you, or it might be something that you suspected, but is literally illegal to say out loud. And he came out here and said the quiet part out loud, But Prigozhin's point was that these kind of corrupt, feckless generals are preventing us from murdering Ukrainians more efficiently. Right?
Yes.
So
let's not forget that.
Right.
Yeah.
So when all these Russian citizens are out in the street cheering him on, are they cheering the fact that he called the war bullshit and that it got 100,000 Russians killed? Or are they cheering because he wants to murder Ukrainians more efficiently? And that's a question that I really don't have an answer to. I mean, Russian opinion is a complete black box. I don't know.
No. I mean, thinking strategically, if he were wise, because it looked like with all these statements and things, it looked like he was certainly either buying himself or Putin a kind of get out of jail card here. With blaming it on the military and blaming it on the military leadership, where Putin could say, I've been deceived by my military leaders and this is a disaster. Or if Prigozhin toppled Putin, he could turn around and say, this war's pointless, wasting resources, cost lots of lives, and it's not my fault. I've been on the front line fighting it myself, and it's all down to Putin, former leadership, or the military leadership. That, I think, would have been a big possibility for him to do that if he had become leader. And I think Prigozhin, in a weird way, has bungled it for himself, because this deal now weakens him, because his men are already getting arrested, they're being rounded up, their families are probably being investigated, houses have been raided. The problem is now Prigozhin is sort of, in a sense, saved his own skin at the cost of his own men, and I'm sure, unless... I'm sure a lot of people are going to be in Wagner are going to be a bit pissed off about that. And you could see a lot of the kind of, what's the word I want now? The sort of just general Wagner members become the kind of scapegoat for some of all of this, whilst he gets away with it.
That's a good point. I think from everything that we've seen, I think it's safe to assume that Prigozhin launch this mutiny, which it had been seemingly planned for a while. I mean, he had been stockpiling ammunition for a while. He certainly had a plan to go. And, like on Friday, there was supposedly Wagner released this video on Telegram that a Wagner camp inside Ukraine was supposedly bombed by the Russian army. And that was kind of the trigger for him to launch this thing. There is no real indication if the Russian military actually did that, or if that was all just sort of like a setup that they did to give them like an excuse to launch the mutiny. We don't know. But I think it's clear he didn't want to challenge Putin. He did not intend to try and overthrow him. I think over the course of this, I think it probably happened a bit quicker and easier than Prigozhin suspected. And he got to the point where he's a couple hundred miles south of Moscow. He's at the point now where, okay, if there's going to be serious bloodshed, it's going to happen soon. And, what if his troops went into Moscow and, the National Guard, the FSB, those kind of security forces just folded? What if other, high-ranking generals, military officers kind of came out and were like, okay, yeah, we'll back you. He could have quickly found himself in a place where he was actively overthrowing Putin's regime, and it's sort of like this saying, like, okay, if you break it, you bought it. And I don't think Prigozhin really wanted that, There's this sort of like, there's a problem usually you see with villains in thriller novels, or I guess, films too, where like they have this, really dastardly, well thought out plan of how they're going to achieve some sort of aims or whatever, but they never consider the problem of, okay, and then what, like you execute your plan, you win, and then what happens, and sometimes that's Brexit. Just because, right. That's Boris. That's what I was sort of alluding to. And sometimes that's just because the author themselves didn't think that far ahead, and it's just sort of like a plot hole. Sometimes it's, a downside of the villain's plan, that was sort of factored in intentionally. But it's the problem of, okay, I do this thing, and then what? And I think that's absolutely what happened with Prigozhin here. He got on the cusp of a really big victory that he did not necessarily intend to have, and I think got the best deal that he could have gotten. I mean, if you consider the way Putin has responded to challenges and crises before, I mean, he's never faced this kind of direct challenge to his leadership before. Russia hasn't seen this kind of armed upheaval inside its borders since the 93 constitutional crisis. But I think if you looked how Putin has responded to challenges before, like in the Second Chechen War, just flattening Grozny, just no mercy at all. Or the tactics that the Russians have used in Syria, in like Aleppo and Idlib, just indiscriminate bombings of civilians. His security forces' response to when a Chechen group took all those hostages at a theater in Moscow in the early 2000s. The exact date escapes me at the time. Those tactics got tons of hostages killed, but it was always just zero something, okay, someone's challenging me, I'm just going to flip the table over and kill everyone, and I think it's really surprising that you didn't see that response from Putin here, that for now anyway, he sort of allowed Prigozhin to walk away. And if anything, that shows you, I think, real fear that Putin has of Prigozhin's influence, that those Russians are out on the street cheering him instead of Putin.
Yeah, well, the stunning lack of loyalty to Putin became very evident very quickly.
Yeah.
And maybe Putin just doesn't have the muscle to be able to build up an aggressive counter to this.
That's true. I mean, how many of his forces are bogged down inside Ukraine? Did Wagner push so far into Russia because there's no one left to respond?
I suspect that might be the case. I think there's probably a very small amount of people in Moscow who, depending on their feelings, may have just laid down their arms and let Wagner take over, because they're supposed to obviously defend the capital.
Yeah.
But I think as we were saying earlier, I think Wagner's sort of seen as the elite of the elite these days.
Yeah.
And I think Prigozhin probably appeals more to soldiers these days than Putin, because Prigozhin's a man of action, man on the front line with those experiences. And I think the ordinary Russian soldier, if you've got to compare yourself with Putin or Prigozhin, I think they're going to go with Prigozhin. I could be completely wrong here. Obviously, Putin has a very tight-knit inner circle who of bodyguards, a bit like the Secret Service, who I'm sure would have done their very best to protect him. But I think we might have seen Putin end up on a plane going somewhere where he could go into exile. I don't think he would have gone down in a blaze of glory. I don't think Putin's got the stones for that. I could be wrong.
No, I mean, I think fleeing Moscow when there really isn't a clear threat yet that he's challenged, I think tells you a lot. That he immediately ran to the bunker. I mean, that's exactly why JSOC on one of the opening nights of the war in Ukraine, JSOC and the CIA offered to evacuate Zelensky to Lviv or even into Poland, and he famously now, said, "I don't need a riot, I need bullets." And I really think if Zelensky had fled Kyiv in those opening days of the war, I think he would have lost. I don't think he would be in charge of Ukraine right now had he done that. And that he stayed in the capital and was like, I'm going to fucking fight here. And if I die, I die. Really kind of gave a signal to everyone else fighting in Ukraine that, okay, our leader's here. He's going to do this with us. And to that point, I mean, if you're a Russian conscript on the front lines in Ukraine, what's your morale right now? Like, why would you want to fight and die for these people?
Yeah. I mean, Putin, just thinking about Putin's famous calendars where he's riding topless on a horse, you didn't see him riding topless on a horse towards Prigozhin, did you?
No. And there's there's a world where Putin stays in the Kremlin, right? And he invites Prigozhin in for an audience. Like, okay, you're pissed off. I get it. Come on in. Let's talk about it, right? And he has this meeting inside the Kremlin, live on state TV. Let's say he brings Shoigu and Gerasimov in there too. And I mean, Putin's done this before. Just sort of publicly on TV, berate Shoigu and Gerasimov, says, all the failures we've had in Ukraine are your fault. You're dismissed. He allows state TV to sort of push this narrative that, he was deceived by bad commanders, placates Wagner for the time being, gives Prigozhin nominally what he wants. I think that could have been spun as a victory for him, and he didn't do it. He ran. I think if you look at it in a self-interested way for us, like, is this good for us? I think this is the best possible outcome for us. Prigozhin and Putin both look weak in the end of this. And we don't have a bloody civil war taking place in Russia. Could it easily have gotten to a really bad place where, like, okay, let's say Putin goes further and he does occupy the Kremlin. And then, there's high-ranking officers in the Strategic Rocket Forces, which governs Russia's 6,000 nukes. Let's say some of those officers say, okay, we're going to side with Prigozhin. And some of them stay loyal to Putin. And now you have two factions in this civil war with nominal control over nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
That's a really bad situation, which is why I think there's, some well-intentioned liberal or pro-Western or pro-Ukrainian voices who have been like, anyone's better than Putin. That's not true.
No.
That is absolutely not true. There are worse people, worse scenarios than Putin. And this weekend showed us why.
Yeah, well, the common consensus from people I've spoken to about Russian affairs is whoever replaces Putin, they're going to come from the right of Putin. And that's because he's pretty much decimated the opposition. And interestingly as well, I mean, I was just collecting a few tweets here and there from people, and I was just... I don't know, once in a while you get an expert who tries to throw a positive spin on things. And I'm trying to find it now, because we had this a few weeks ago with the Turkish election with the Foreign Policy magazine, where it was saying something along the lines of, do not underestimate the power of the youth vote and stuff. And, it was business as usual in Turkey in the end of that election. And there was somebody somewhere, and I now can't find the tweet, which I screen grabbed, who basically was just sort of... being critical of that consensus that whoever's going to replace Putin will come from the right, and that we shouldn't underestimate the sort of liberal Russian forces. But the problem is, I mean, the people on the right of Putin are very well armed, very well connected, whilst the liberals on the other side are not well armed, they're not well connected, and their key leaders are all in prison, poisoned or dead. Famously, Boris Nemtsov got shot right outside the Kremlin. That's sort of how Putin has treated the would-be sort of liberals in his country. I'm not optimistic at all about Russia's political future currently.
No.
And if somebody of the right does take over, and if they do decide to continue on the war, because logically speaking, it's a good moment to stop the war, but they could say, no, I'm going to just throw everything I've got at it, because Prigozhin even mentioned at one point earlier on that he would bring in martial law in Russia.
Total mobilization.
Yeah, proper conscription, stuff like that. And he's not an idiot. He probably knows militarily what he needs to defeat Ukraine. And he certainly, if Russia, Russia still have... some heavy weapons and stuff they could use. Obviously, they've used an awful lot of stuff, but they haven't exhausted everything. And if they pulled in all their mercenaries from abroad and brought them all to focus on Ukraine, and they probably, I hate to say it, probably could win. If a Russian president who was sort of more tactically savvy wanted to try it. So, let's not rest too easy on all this. So.
I think... there's long been this kind of fantasy among Western liberals that there would be like this Aaron Sorkin kind of scenario where the Russians rise up and overthrow Putin, and he's replaced by like Alexei Navalny, and all is well, and we go back to like the end of history type bullshit, right? And if I'm being frank, I think Navalny's a very inspiring figure, but I think his base of support has always been primarily Western liberals who want this romanticized version of what Russia could be. I think to that point, Prigozhin has the political capital amongst Russian citizens that we've sort of falsely imagined that Navalny has had. I mean, I think we'll be lucky if Navalny survives the year with sort of the rate he's going inside a Russian prison. To your point, I think any real challenge right now comes from Putin's right, which is scary. Like I had a friend of mine Thursday night texted me. He asked me two questions that were very good questions. He said, does a weak Putin mean danger for Americans? And I guess we could substitute Americans for the whole Western alliance, right? And I said, a weak Putin, no. I think a weak Putin is good for us. But a corner Putin, yes, is dangerous. That's bad. The second question he asked was, does America generally benefit from a stable dictatorship in Russia? And I said, we benefit from the predictability and professional experience of a stable dictatorship in Russia, especially when it comes to the question of nuclear weapons, that you have kind of old, stable hands in control of these units, right? We also, I think, benefit from a materialistic Russia in the sense that you usually don't want to die if you like yachts and apartments in Mayfair and villas in the French Riviera, And what scares me about Prigozhin and that kind of ultra-nationalistic militarism that he represents is I think that's a shift away from the materialism and the decadence that Putinism has brought to Russian society. And if you see that shift away, I mean, to that point, okay, you're a lot more willing to die and take everyone with you if you don't care about that nice villa on the French Riviera anymore. That's food for thought.
Yeah, well, nice segue, I think, into the Anne Applebaum piece, because kind of why were the people cheering for Prigozhin? So this sort of slightly goes into that, and so this is called "Putin Caught in His Own Trap" by Anne Applebaum for The Atlantic. I actually had to do a 30-day subscription to be able to read this, so I think it is behind a paywall, and I apologize, but it is a good article. So some journalism's worth paying for, and I think Anne Applebaum.
The Atlantic really has good coverage too. Anyway,
it does.
The Atlantic's worth the subscription.
Yeah, they're not a sponsor, but maybe we should get them to be a sponsor. But there we are. With Anne's piece, the Wagner mercenaries attempted what she has termed an aborted coup in Rostov-on-Don in Russia, and the arrival of the Wagner group in the city did not face any resistance, and they were not shot at. People in Rostov-on-Don, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Rostov-on-Don, initially showed little concern about the presence of the mercenaries, with even some engaging with them and bringing them food. The response of the public and the military leaders in the city indicated a level of apathy towards existing regime and a lack of opposition to the Wagner forces. She believes that the apathy might be fueled by propaganda and cynicism, and that's been a powerful tool for autocrats like Putin to discourage political engagement and dissent. Russians have not shown a significant support for the war in Ukraine, and there's been a lack of organized opposition or support for it. So there's not been any huge protests for or against the war other than state-run, those state events we saw with Putin in a stadium, I think last year, at a football stadium, with a crowd of people who I think were paid to pretend to look like they were supporting the war. The lack of response from the security services and military during the coup the attempted coup highlights the regime's vulnerability and uncertainty of who would respond to a serious challenge to Putin's power. The motives behind the attempted coup and the details of the exchange for standing down still remain unknown, and that's still the case, I believe. And the incident exposes the fragility of the regime's ideology and the softness of its support, potentially leading to increased repression and chaos in the future. So yeah, I think we're going to start potentially seeing show trials. You might even see executions over this. I think there probably is going to be some sort of crackdown, but I could be wrong there. But that's my feeling.
I think apathy is a very important word there that Anne Applebaum used. I think that's sort of the key word to describe all of this. I mean, I think Russians generally, and again, Russian public opinion is very hard to gauge. It's kind of a black box. I mean, it's literally illegal to voice any opinion other than you support the war. If you live in that society, like, you kind of keep your mouth shut unless you support the war, right?
It's like the old Soviet times, from what I've read from my favorite Russian spy, Oleg Gordievsky.
Yeah, drink. I think Russians generally don't follow politics closely. I think they're not very well informed. I think they're kind of stuck in the minutia of their day-to-day life, and they generally don't care about these matters so long as it doesn't disrupt their daily lives. To that point, I think I've said this before. I think they're very similar culturally to Americans in that regard, and that's a cynical view that I have. Not everyone will agree, but I think we have a lot in common with the Russians in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I'll come to that in a minute, actually.
Out of that apathy, they're cheering Wagner. Is it just because they're like, okay, this is cool, okay, it's exciting, there's tanks parked outside my apartment building, let me go take pictures? At the same point, they saw someone say the quiet part out loud, and so far not be punished for it. I mean, will Prigozhin, there's been indications that the FSB hasn't dropped a criminal case against him yet, but part of the deal was that it would be. We haven't seen that yet. Shoigu and Gerasimov have not been replaced or dismissed yet. To my knowledge, I don't think we've seen or heard anything from them since this started.
No, Lavrov's come out. I was looking at the BBC.
The foreign minister.
Yeah, and he's saying that the Wagner mercenaries will continue in Africa, is what I've seen so far.
Under Ministry of Defense or Foreign Ministry Authority? Because part of this deal was Russian Wagner mercenaries would just sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, and they would just be kind of absorbed. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, so yeah, they saw someone say the quiet part out loud and have yet to really be punished for that. I mean, if I were Prigozhin, I would avoid any high windows
or herbal
for
tea
the time being, or herbal tea. definitely I would double check my underwear and make sure it's not damp before I put it on or something. I mean, they applied nerve gas to Navalny's underwear, I think.
Nerve agent, yeah. As Dan,
nerve agent,
because he's told us about. Apparently, the groin is a really great area for absorption of poisons. Apparently, so
right. So I would be careful of that if I were him. I don't know if we'll see, crackdowns to the extent that we saw like in Turkey after that failed coup in 2016. I don't know. It would certainly make Putin look even weaker than he does anyway right now if he does nothing. It's like if you come at the king, you best not miss, and they missed.
Yeah, they did.
Or I think the better part is they had the king in the crosshairs and chose not to fire.
Indeed. Sorry, I just look at the BBC. I see Lavrov is saying Russia's investigating Western involvement in the Wagner mutiny. So I could already see a narrative being spun here that sort of fits into that NATO v Putin thing.
Another sort of good segue into an aspect of this. So it very quickly after, I think Saturday night, after this thing was kind of resolved, the Wall Street Journal were the first to report this, followed quickly by like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Shane Harris had an article on this too, that the U.S. intelligence community had some forewarning or some reason to suspect that Prigozhin would openly challenge the Ministry of Defense. I think beginning in like early June, we had some indications, but we didn't know exactly when or how it would happen. I definitely think we didn't suspect that it would happen as quickly as it did. We apparently even briefed the Gang of Eight. So like the top leadership of Congress, that this was coming. I think it's so like, okay, what does the U.S. intelligence community do with that information? And the answer is, I mean, you really can't do much of anything. I think you put assets in place to be able to listen and gather as much information as possible when it does go down. Apart from that, really the best thing you can do is just shut the fuck up, I mean, Putin has always been highly afraid of these quote unquote color revolutions. This wasn't quite that, but always looks for a reason to say that, this is a Western plot against me, all, spun up, and it's all fake. So it's kind of not surprising to see Lavrov take that tack now. But, one of the reasons I say is in these situations, one of the best things you can do is just shut up. Because you don't know exactly what's happening or how it's going to unfold, and you also don't want to give Putin any ammunition at all to say, oh yeah, this is like a Western plot against me. And if Biden came out and was like, ha, look at this, to any extent, you give him that ammunition, which is again a benefit to have people in charge who know when to shut the fuck up.
Yeah, indeed. I know there's been some talk about, obviously the Battle of Bakhmut has sort of been one of the trigger points of this, and whether the wisdom of the Ukrainians was to keep that battle going. So I know Western allies were questioning that judgment a few months ago. And I know actually Professor O'Brien wrote a really good Substack actually about the wisdom of the Battle of Bakhmut. If you're going to go through his Substack, you'll find it. So you could argue that this war, this battle was sort of the tipping point that may have destabilized Putin, which may or may not help the Ukrainians. So yeah.
And the Ukrainians, I think, just recently retook Bakhmut. I think as this mutiny was ongoing, they retook it after 10 months. Over at least 10,000 Russian troops were killed trying to take this kind of strategically insignificant village. There's been a lot of reporting in the months before this that Ukrainian intelligence was potentially had kind of a weird relationship with Prigozhin and Wagner. That one of the things that came out of the Discord leaks was this reporting that Prigozhin possibly was giving targeting information for Russian military units to the Ukrainians, like, hey, go ahead and hit these guys. We don't know if that's true at all.
Yeah.
But the Ukrainians have definitely been working behind the scenes to sort of exacerbate this rift between Prigozhin and Shoigu.
And why not?
To their credit.
Why not?
Yeah.
Because
that's war.
For Ukraine, it's a fight for survival. And I think some people forget this sometimes. It's not just some event happening on the news. For the Ukrainians, this is literally the battle for their very existence, and they will try everything at their disposal to win the war. So I don't blame them for that. I just want to come back to your point about apathy and obviously the connection. You were comparing American voters to Russians. I would say also I've seen it in UK politics. I think the Brexit vote and then obviously the general low voter turnout during elections in the UK indicate to me there are large chunks of the UK population who are disengaged from the kind of mainstream political process. Now, I find it funny sometimes, and I was just reflecting on I think what you said in the preamble of our last podcast, and there was a review a while back where we have to position ourselves as pro-democracy. Yeah. And I find that kind of weirdly odd, having to position yourself as pro-democracy, because for me at least, I don't know, I think democracy is a very important thing, and I would have thought that most people would I would say in my mind would wisely think that a democracy is a good and positive thing and important. And I've just
like you wouldn't have to you wouldn't have to say that, it would just be assumed.
Yeah, exactly. But we live in an age now where we have to say these things. It's kind of funny. Yeah. And so a couple of things. I mean, number one, I think these events over the weekend do demonstrate the power of democracy, because I think I put it on Twitter that in a democracy, presidents, prime ministers, chancellors retire. They don't die in a bloody coup. Whilst in dictatorships, it usually ends in a violent overthrow, and then said dictator gets deposed of violently, and usually ends up at Colonel Gaddafi or something like that, or worse. So that's my thing for democracy. So anecdotally, what I've noticed, I mean, there's a lot of people who are disengaged from the UK political process, and I've noticed a lot of my dwindling number of friends in the arts who identifies on the left, or even identify themselves as spiritual, seem to have this bizarre view on voting. They seem to think that not voting is somehow a noble and ethical thing to do. And I've never understood that. Why is not voting somehow ethical? I don't understand that. And I can say that this attitude has been quite popular among millennials of my age and older Gen Xers as well. And I don't know whether people younger than me still hold those views or not, but a lot of people at my age seem to do so. Not everybody, but just quite a few. Sort of that lefty arts area. And also, with the rise of conspiracy content in the 90s, and now much of it linked to Russian propaganda efforts, many of those conspiracy theories promote this idea that elites rule everything and mainstream politics is a con and voting is a waste of time. And you can see how this can influence people and create a sort of apathy and disengagement from the political process. And I can say from my own personal experience when I was a conspiracy theorist, one of the many things that pulled me out of it was the fact that I noticed that so many people in my circle just did not engage in mainstream politics at all, and they saw it as worthless. And that number of people has definitely grown, obviously, since COVID. And you could argue during, I think 2016 is when conspiracy theories sort of became quite mainstream in a destructive way, because before that it was sort of just UFO stuff connected to the X-Files, but now it's sort of neo-Nazi ideas wrapped up in some pseudo-spiritual stuff or pseudo-leftist kind of politics. And so seeing the reaction of the public greeting the Wagner mercenaries with an open hand does make me wonder, whether some of the apathy in the West is a result of Russian propaganda efforts. That is my big speculation.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it definitely is. Yeah. I mean, if you just look at who's pushing this content, who's making this content, who's sort of best figured out that these algorithms benefit or these algorithms push outrage. Outrage gets more clicks. Outrage gets your eyeballs staying in the app. It's definitely the Russians. So yeah, they're absolutely. It's sad to see. I mean, I'm sort of not going into a lot of details. I'm sort of in the position right now where, watching an old friend of mine go down the sort of extremist conspiracy theory rabbit hole in real time, and it absolutely tracks what they say of how it happens. It's just sort of fun contrarian stuff like, oh, UFOs, that's kind of cool and interesting. Is that real? And then it goes into, vaccine skepticism and just now reaching, I see indications it's just far right ideology is where they are, and it's kind of sad to see
it is
happening before your eyes.
It is, and I think a lot of those people don't realize it's far right ideology either.
No,
and that's because if they did, they would probably earlier on their journey kind of take a step back and. But the further down that kind of rabbit hole or YouTube algorithm you go, the worse it kind of gets, doesn't it?
I thought that too. I mean, so one of the people I've sort of seen them circling is a guy named Matt Walsh, who is sort of one of the biggest in the US, one of the biggest voices pushing a lot of like anti-trans legislation, book bans. Basically started the whole kind of thing that, gay people are like groomers and stuff, or they're pedophiles. And I mean, I've been open about this. I'm bisexual. I've seen that. And to, see a friend of yours fall down this rabbit hole and follow people who believe those things, you think like, do you actually believe that too? Or do you just not understand what these people represent? And neither answer is good.
No, that's the thing. Is I think a lot of people do casually accept stuff, and then it kind of just, it sort of follows a logic that keeps building and building and building. If they actively follow these things, that leads to very ugly places. I've seen I've had a friend who started off as a real sort of peace-loving spiritual person, and from early 2002, then the Iraq War happened. They sort of got into 9/11 conspiracy theories, and they got more and more radicalized to the point where they have become an incel. They've been openly supportive of Trump, of Brexit, of sort of right-wing ideas. And if you compare him to who he was 20 years prior, he's very different. But he doesn't see the difference. That's the interesting thing. He still sees himself as spiritual, still sees himself as sort of leftish, doesn't vote out of principle. And it's just like, wow. It's a heck of a journey, and it's just, sad, really.
To your point there, it starts with apathy. I think it starts with being unengaged to the point of being so uninformed or misinformed that you make yourself an easy target for bad actors. Is that going back to what were these people in Rostov cheering? Were they cheering the fact that, these generals have gotten 100,000 of our, sons, brothers killed, and we are glad that someone's saying that and standing up against it, which would be heartening? Or are they cheering because they've been so swept up in this, propaganda stew that's very clear in Russia, and they're like, we should kill more Ukrainians. Is that what they're cheering for? And again, I don't know.
And if it is that, crikey,
we got a problem on our hands.
Indeed. Well, look, I'm going to wrap up in a moment, Matt, but is there anything else you'd like to add before we do wrap up today?
No, I think we got it. I think we dodged a big bullet this weekend. Again, I think the outcome was the best for the pro-democracy sort of alliance that we have here. Prigozhin and Putin both look weak. We don't have a bloody civil war. What happens from here, I don't know. I don't know. It
could have been. I mean, I think as we said earlier, the last thing we really want is see a civil war in Russia that involves open fighting, because especially with all those nukes and all that floating around, it's sort of the doomsday scenario. The Americans are very concerned about that in the 90s, and I know it sort of inspired quite a few Tom Clancy novels and a lot of 90s action thrillers, that scenario. So
my active measures series is set largely in the aftermath of a pro-Putin of a Putin-like figure being deposed by quietly, a lot quieter than this would have been, but quietly deposed by a cabal of generals and security officials to his right. And, the series follows what happens after that. It's pretty scary what can happen.
Yeah, we were on the money with that. Where can listeners get that book?
That's on Amazon.
Cool.
You just search Active Measures, Matt Fulton, or go to my website, mattfulton.net, and you get links to it right there.
Brilliant. And it's in the show notes as well. So I'm just going to wrap us up with Swan Lake. So following the unfolding events on Twitter on Friday and Saturday morning, I noticed a lot of references to Swan Lake, and at first I wasn't 100% sure what that was a reference to, so pardon my ignorance there, but apparently it relates to during the 1991 August coup. Swan Lake was apparently played on a loop on state television, and it's become synonymous in Russia with political unrest, and it actually dates back to 1982. Apparently Swan Lake became an omen for political unrest with the death of Leonid Brezhnev in 1982, and state TV broadcast the ballet as a new leader was chosen by Soviet officials. So so that's why Swan Lake was sort of trending a little bit on Twitter over the weekend. We don't have the rights to Swan Lake, so unfortunately I can't play that as we finish up today, but I'm sure you could YouTube it, and next time you watch or hear Swan Lake, you'll have a different perspective on it. So there we are. So Matt, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Chris.
You've already mentioned where people can find you. Is it mattfulton.com?
.net.
So mattfulton.net is where they can find you.
.com is a different guy.
Okay.
.net, not .com.
.net.
.net.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to look me up, I'm just chriscarr.co.uk. On there is just sort of my film-related stuff. And obviously our podcast, Secrets and Spies, has its own website, which is www.secretsandspiespodcast.com. We're also on Twitter, just at Secrets and Spies. But more importantly, we are on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/secrets and spies, you can directly support this show, and you get a set of coasters or a coffee cup depending on your level of support, and you'll get access to our show Extra Shot. And what I will do, just as a special thing for Patreon, I'm going to share the wider notes of this episode, because we amassed an awful lot of links of potential articles that we didn't read out, but I think are all worth having a look at, and I think the articles that we talk about today are very much worth a read, and I'll definitely put a link to those in the show notes for this show. So I hope everybody found this useful, and thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you on the next podcast. You take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.